that is not a respect for the people and their liberty and their time and so on. So we really need that kind of cultural shift in the ranks of government. That's going to be a tall order. It's going to be very difficult, but I think if we can achieve that, we'll be on our way to something good.
The latest case of alleged abuse of citizens by the VIP blue light brigades have pervaded the public conversation in South Africa in the past week. Joining me to discuss that particular issue, but more widely and perhaps more importantly, is Martin van Staden, Head of Policy at the Free Market Foundation. Martin has recently published a report for the Institute of Race Relations on South Africa and civil liberty, specifically in South Africa. The report we will link to in the description below. Martin, just to start off with, perhaps to concretize for people discussions when we talk about civil liberties and the abuse thereof. Unfortunately, when we see these sorts of incidents, as happened on the highway in Johannesburg recently, that sort of makes real the abuse of civil liberties by politicians.
Yeah, it does, and it's kind of a very manifest like expression of that. It's very clear, it's very crude. It's not something that's really easily deniable. There you see where government places itself really kind of in the leadership role of society rather than being a service provider to society, almost regarding itself as a king and a monarch that may rule absolutely. But the reality is that most intrusions, and maybe the most dangerous intrusions into civil liberty, are far less like obvious in that way. So here we can see someone is beat up. Clearly their Section 12 right to freedom of security of the person, their Section 10 right to human dignity have clearly been violated. But we have other things like the NHI, the hate speech bill, the expropriation bill. These are all far more kind of risky intrusions into civil liberty, yet we don't have this type of discourse around that. So this is what the report that the IRR published kind of goes into, to say, listen, we have a great constitution, we have these guarantees for freedom, we have a strong civil society, our courts are quite okay, yet our civil liberty is still under threat, and this is how that is, and this is why civil liberty is important, and this is why we really need to be conscious of it and defend it.
Martin, your focus in the report then from 1994 up until now, so democratic South Africa's story. One of the most recent examples of the abuse of civil liberties maybe is state capture, and Chief Justice Raymond Zondo has warned that he thinks Parliament, for example, might very well go along if sort of state capture 2.0 happens again. So just a question and a bit of a discussion around, on the one hand, the talk of civil liberty and why it's enshrined in the Constitution, why it's so important, but then we don't see it being carried out, as it were. So what you found since 1994 in that particular vein?
Yeah, so look, civil liberty, when you kind of take our kind of liberal approach to what government is and what it should be, is really the highest calling of the state. We have governments specifically because we need a coercive institution to protect our liberty in a better and fairer way than we can do ourselves as individuals. And Parliament, being the democratic representative of the people, should in fact be at the very forefront of protecting civil liberty, because the idea, when you go back in the British parliamentary tradition that we share, is that this is really the most powerful expression of the people in government, Parliament. We send our people from amongst ourselves, our representatives, to government to go and fight for our interests. But Parliament is kind of the originator of many of the civil liberty breaches that we see today, and state capture is certainly an example of that. Because what is state capture other than the well-placed cadres and comrades using discretionary powers granted to them in legislation to kind of operate in the public interest and to kind of apply their mind to do things that kind of benefit the public, and then it just so happens to kind of benefit them, their own pockets, a little bit more than it does the public. But this is what you get when you have a parliament that says, listen, we're going to trust government officials and so on to do these things, so give them the discretion to implement it. And lo and behold, we have state capture. But there is a far deeper form of state capture, I think you might agree, and that is the state really going into domains that do not concern it and taking over those domains. And I think national health insurance is maybe the most topical version of that. It originated many years ago, and somehow a lot of people regard it as like a good thing. It's an act of social justice. But what is it ultimately more than government coming into our healthcare affairs and saying, we're not gonna let you make these decisions for yourself anymore. We will have a benefits committee that will determine what kind of what you're covered for, and if maybe when you have an infection, we might determine that no, it's not going to be cost effective for us to kind of cover that for you, so you're on your own, even though we nationalize your healthcare. That is a very fundamental intrusion on civil liberty, and very, I would say, a very nice example of state capture of healthcare. So yeah, Parliament is the biggest perpetrator here against the civil liberties of the people, and using the instrument of the executive. And unfortunately, the courts, which around the world and also in South Africa has kind of become that institution we expect now to protect us against Parliament, quite a perverse state of affairs. The courts also don't really get that right always. They've protected civil liberty in a very haphazard fashion. And now we're left with civil society. Thank goodness South Africa has a very strong civil society that's very jealously protective of freedom under law.
And then, Martin, my final question to you, perhaps linking there to just your last points around civil society, some of the recommendations that you have in the report around how one can strengthen the protections on civil liberty, maybe the respect thereof, the enforcement thereof, if that's the sort of right word. We as classical liberals, we want regulations to be repealed, but if more regulations or legislation, for example, were to be imposed, certain amendments or reforms to strengthen civil liberty in South Africa, what do you advise in that regard?
Yeah, so my main recommendations are to the courts and how they should apply Section 36 of the Constitution, which is all about how government may limit our rights. And I go into quite a bit of detail about how the courts can rejig that approach to really bring to the fore civil liberty rather than government agendas. So that's the focus. But I do also have a list of legislative or parliamentary interventions that certainly not this government, but hopefully a future government would strongly consider. And these include things like Parliament compelling the executive. So most of our legislation comes from ministers. Parliament should compel ministers whenever they adopt, let's say, the NHI bill. They write this bill, and clearly it's going to limit your freedom of choice in healthcare. The Minister of Health must, at that provision, justify, according to Section 36 of the Constitution, which is a very high standard, must justify why this limitation of the right to freedom of choice in healthcare is justifiable. Why is it reasonable in an open and democratic society based on freedom, dignity, and equality? We haven't seen that in South Africa. Ministers just introduce legislation willy-nilly, and then maybe in a few years they kind of say, yeah, it's justifiable when they get to court. But what I recommend is the justification must precede the limitation of rights. So that's one thing. Another thing is a Protection of Property Act, where we, in fact, where Parliament does say, listen, the protection of your property rights is also part of the kind of domain of civil liberty, and it has to very clearly state to the executive how it may interfere with South Africans' private property. And that's a situation that currently is very undefined, very nebulous, where the assumption is kind of the executive may just kind of interfere with your property if it's in the public interest. So there's various recommendations, but I think the most difficult one, but the most important one, is that we need to inculcate a respect for civil liberty amongst our civil servants, like these so-called police officers who beat up the motorists at the side of the road. Clearly, these individuals were not trained or schooled or inculcated with the idea that we as officers of the government, our highest calling is to protect the civil liberty of the people. That never occurred to these individuals. They think they can just beat people up willy-nilly. But it's a broader problem. When you go to the traffic department, people roll their eyes at you when you're waiting for your license and so forth. That is not a respect for the people and their liberty and their time and so on. So we really need that kind of cultural shift in the ranks of government. That's going to be a tall order. It's going to be very difficult. But I think if we can achieve that, we'll be on our way to something good. But maybe the unmentioned part of the report is that luckily South Africa has something that very few other countries have, and that is a strong civil society, as you've mentioned, that kind of doesn't make these recommendations existentially necessary. We are protecting our civil liberty through sheer force of community and state proofing, and being conscious of the ineptitude and the maliciousness of the government we live under. So that's very good, and that's very positive for South Africa.
Thank you very much for watching. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, we invite you to do so. And a reminder, please, before you leave, to like this video. That always helps boost the reach and the views that we get on our videos. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.